Welcome back to The Takeout. As we mentioned at the top of the show, 99 days till the midterms. Quick math, 435 House seats up for grabs, 35 seats in the Senate. As you know, lots of twists and turns this primary season. Texas, yes, for sure, set off our redistricting sort of bonfire that spread across the country. Progressives have risen in the Democratic Party in conspicuous ways. And the Supreme Court weakened the Voting Rights Act and struck down some campaign finance limits. All that being poured into the cauldron in the midterm elections. Here to talk about this, a lot more with details and data as always. CBS News Executive Director of Elections and Surveys, Anthony Salvanto, and CBS News contributor Kyle Kondik. He's also the managing editor of Sabato's Crystal Ball at the University of Virginia Center for Politics. All right, Anthony, starting with you, the big aperture. What's at stake?
I'm going to make that math even simpler for everybody, Major. There are very few competitive House races on the board right now. Now, maybe that changes over the next 99 days, but everybody needs to understand just how narrow the playing field is. You just mentioned redistricting. That's one reason for it. People's partisanship is another. But the bottom line is, right now, I think Kyle sees about the same thing. Got about 15 really toss-up House districts out of that 435 you mentioned, a handful leaning one side or the other to Republicans or to Democrats. What that means is that as folks watch this unfold, yes, we can talk about generic ballots. Yes, we can talk about presidential approval ratings. But all of that is going to be sort of forced through a very narrow field such that it's not necessarily going to be reflective of large national swings if they occur. Bottom line is, watch the competitive races, and very few of them also, frankly, in the Senate out of that 35 that you mentioned as well. I'll probably let Kyle unpack those a little bit. But the bottom line there is the Democrats will need to flip a number of Republican-held Senate seats in order to take control of the Senate, too. And that looks like a maybe doable, but probably somewhat of a harder hill than the House is.
Well, Anthony has set us up quite easily, Kyle. So pick up the ball on the Senate side.
Yeah, the way that we look at it, we have 49 races leaning to the Republicans, 47 leaning to the Democrats, and 4 toss-ups at our crystal ball ratings. The way it works is that because 50-50 is still a Republican Senate, because the vice president is breaking the ties, Democrats would have to win all 4 of the toss-ups in order to win the Senate. So, like, it's there, and we know what those races are, but I think Republicans are still favored in the Senate.
Right. So let's go down the 4 and rank them in whichever order you prefer. Strongest Republican advantage or strongest Democratic advantage?
Yeah, I'd say strongest Democratic advantage is probably Michigan still, but we've got this really hot primary that's not really guaranteed to produce a great Democratic candidate next week, so we're going to see how that shakes out. But, you know...
But Michigan isn't a pickup. Michigan is a hold.
That's right. That's right. That's the one toss-up that's a defensive assignment for Democrats. And then you're looking at North Carolina, where we have Democrats favored.
Roy Cooper, the Democratic nominee,
that's right,
running ahead.
Yeah, and
Michael Whatley, the former GOP chairman.
Right, and then Maine, which the Democrats just swapped out their candidate there.
Troy Jackson just this Saturday officially became the nominee.
Yeah, and that, I think, is a true toss-up. And then you got Ohio and Alaska, where Sherrod Brown, former Democratic senator, is running. From Ohio. And then Mary Peltola, former Democratic House member from Alaska, trying to run for the Senate. You know, we have those as toss-ups. I think ultimately in red states, you'd probably still rather be the Republican. But those are, you know, I think the most attractive targets for Democrats.
Anthony, let's talk about independents, because I've seen a slew of recent surveys, ours, Fox, and you and others, saying that independents on a wide array of issues, but particularly those dealing with the economy and the war, have deeply soured on President Trump. And when they did so, meaning independents, on Joe Biden, that created massive political complications for not just Joe Biden, but Democrats writ large. Is that a storyline we should be paying attention to? And could that enlarge from 15 to maybe 20 or 25 some House races?
Honestly, I don't think it's the most important thing.
Got it.
I think, and I'll tell you why. I think the most important voter, or one of them here, is going to be the person who came out to vote for Donald Trump, the Republican or the Republican leaner, who decides whether or not to vote in a midterm. Now, folks might recall presidential election turnout versus midterm turnout. The midterms are always a little bit lower, maybe about 20 points lower. So who are those people that don't vote in the midterm but do vote in the presidential? I wonder if, and we're going to follow closely, Republicans who support the president but don't necessarily carry that support over to the Republican Party. I look at things like a more than 20-point gap among Republicans between how they see the president handling immigration, where they're really, really strong on him, and how they see him handling inflation, where they're 20 to 22 points lower. So what is this election about? I think that's determinative in that turnout sense for Republicans on the other side. If they can motivate those folks to turn out again, replicate that coalition from 24, they got a much better shot.
So, Kyle, Anthony tells me, and I heed his advice always, independence, interesting, but not as relevant as base turnout on the GOP side. Agree or disagree?
I think Anthony's done a good job of talking about the turnout dynamic. I think there is also a persuasion dynamic. One of the things we've seen in polls is that, and this was true in 2022 when Republicans really didn't do quite as well as maybe they could or should have done in that election, is that there are people who just somewhat disapproved of President Biden and also disapprove of President Trump. And in the last election, they split kind of 50-50 in the actual, the House and Senate races. And so Trump is at a really weak approval. But in the polls, if you look at it and you look at those, not the strong disapprovers, but the somewhat disapprovers, Republicans are still holding up okay with those folks. How do those people vote? Do they even show up? Do they stick with Republicans even though they disapprove of Trump? That could help limit the damage for Republicans, or this election could turn out into a Democratic mega wave if those somewhat disapprovers move to the Democrats.
Anthony Salvanto, Kyle Kondik, very good stuff. As always, I thank you both. Thank you so much.